Hello and welcome to another edition of Health Solutions with Shawn and Janet Needham, where Team Needham discusses everything healthcare. I'm your host, Shawn Needham, along with my wonderful wife, Janet. And today I'm super excited to have Sean Casey back on our podcast. We are going to be discussing nutrition and fitness for kids. This is a big passion of mine and Janet's, partly because we have kids, but also because we realize that kids grow into be adults and we want adults to be healthy. So you got to start them out early as kids. So, Sean, welcome to our show.
Be on the show again. Excited to be on. It's a great topic, so I look forward to diving into things.
Yeah. So for those of our listeners and viewers that haven't don't know your history and your past, tell us a little bit about you, Sean.
No, I'd be more than happy to. So I'm a registered dietitian, specialize in sports nutrition as well as just general proactive health nutrition. Also work as a physical preparation coach. I've been fortunate to work with professional athletes from most sports, as well as Olympian gold medalists. So I love working from all ends of the spectrum, from young to old to various skill starting levels.
And tell us where you are flying tomorrow.
I'll actually be flying to Denmark tomorrow. One of my
Oh.
clients, he's prepping for the world champs in his respective sport. That's going to be at the end of August. So we're going to be doing 3 weeks of intense training together leading up to the world champs.
I
How
I love it.
exciting.
And do you mind sharing what that sport is?
Yeah, that's badminton. So one of my clients is his name is Victor Axelson. He's a defending Olympic gold medalist in men's singles for badminton, multi-time world champion, great hard worker. He's one of those people who helps kind of breathe fire into what you do because when everything is focused and passionate.
Yeah, I gotta think badminton. I'm just thinking out loud, kind of a mix between pickleball and tennis, maybe, sort of, kind
Yeah,
of.
that would actually
And
be pretty good.
yeah, and
Between 8 to 10% body fat
yeah,
any day of the week. So he's 6'4", so really tall. Especially for the sport of badminton.
right.
Burns through a lot of energy in a hurry.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so tell us a little bit about we want to focus on nutrition and fitness for kids. I'm going to let Janet take over here and just talk about what's going on with kids and fitness and nutrition.
Well, the first thing I would say as watching and as a mother, it's these things, the cell phones or the videos or not being active. So that's part of the problem. And then we add on top of it the dietary things that as Americans we have bought into. So I'm going to let Sean talk about it, but I mean, my focus, I guess, as a parent was get him outside, get him moving, and also the cleaner the diet, meaning the fresher the diet, the better. But I'm going to let you go full force, Sean.
No, and I think this is such a great and relevant topic today. And I think a lot of it too, like you mentioned, everything is so glued to a phone right now, as opposed to getting outside. And I think that's one of the things, I think about when I was growing up was I spent most of my summer outside running around, kind of
Right.
that
Yeah.
creative free play.
Mhm.
And between safety issues, technology, I feel like a lot of that has been pulled out of the lifestyle of
Right.
a lot of young kids.
Yeah, I agree, and I think don't you think that nutrition and fitness for kids does it first come from the parents as role models?
Absolutely. I think most kids model what they see at home. And so I think as parents or guardians, if you're setting that good example, makes it much more natural, easy to get outside, play, run around, eat quality foods. It's fascinating working as a dietitian. I talk with parents all the time, or even when I'm working with like student athlete kids, and I'm like, oh, what are the foods that you enjoy, or what foods tend to go over well? And it's interesting. Obviously, most kids like sweets, things of that nature, and adults do too. But what is fascinating is the number of people are like, oh, like I really like the foods that they like are not necessarily because they're sweet. It's because they're foods that they make together with like the family. The number of foods were like, oh, as a kid, I shopped with my parents for this, and then we made it together, and I found it to be really tasty. I think that's a big thing. That's an easy step that gets missed quite often.
Yeah, so basically what you're saying is, it's a learned response. It's an acquired taste. They only know what they've been fed, right? And if you
Absolutely.
feed them Right. And if you feed them good food at home, then they will tend to like it. I know I can tell you I have a weight loss journey myself. 13 years ago, I was 60 pounds heavier and considered obese, definitely. And my kids were developing into young teenagers, and I wanted to be able to, you know, play with them, play sports with them, be active with them, and be a good role model. And I will tell you, we had one son that was overweight, and it'd be really difficult for me, and we knew he was overweight, but it would be really difficult for me to ask him to, be healthier when I wasn't healthy. So I will say that when it came down to after I lost weight, both my kids started becoming more active and ate healthier because we were.
Mhm. And it's really interesting too when it comes to foods. This is something I remember learning when I was going through my dietetic schooling. Was most there's some the only two flavors that people are naturally drawn to like are sweet and salty. Beyond that, everything is a learned or acquired taste. And I think what happens is somebody has a food maybe once they don't like it. And so parents never make it again, not realizing it takes those multiple exposures to foods, or maybe you cook the food in a slightly different way or add different spices or seasonings, whatever it is. And that's a big thing that I always reinforce when I'm working with parents is, hey, make sure you're exposing your kids the foods multiple times, because again, everything is almost an acquired taste for the most part.
So Janet, as a mother that cooked for her kids, what kind of things do you have to say about that?
Right. I agree what Sean is saying. One of the things that was really helpful, I think, for both my kids, especially my youngest, because he kind of had texture things that he was kind of fussy with. It was like easier when he chose, like if we went to the store or something, if he chose something, we could work with it. Um, and then he became a little more excited about better choices. And I think, learning and actually finding out what makes something different for them, whether it would be just a condiment or a seasoning or something, maybe not cooked as long, or I mean, there's just little things that you can tweak along the way, but you do work with them. My oldest, I think he just consumed, and he's actually he'll eat almost anything, I think. There's not very many, but he also had a different sense of when he was full. When he was full, he's done, and he's always been that way. If he's hungry, he eats. When he's full, he's done. Where Jordan, I think, wasn't like that. I think there was maybe, a learned thing, or he just didn't have that sensation. So, I think that's the other thing too. As a parent, I learned that, you have to kind of work with that too. When you're done, it's okay to leave something on your plate, not clean it up. I mean, like Sean and I were taught, you cleaned your plate. Well, maybe just not take as much the next time.
No,
Well, yeah, go ahead, Sean.
no, I cut you off. Go forward.
Well, I think, the thing about, my youngest son, you know, one of the issues that he saw is he probably just followed me, and I'm the kind of guy that I will eat anything in front of me. I mean, and where my oldest son, like Janet says, I mean, no matter what he's eating, if he's done, he's done. His plate can be half full, he's done. And I think it's important for us as parents to not teach our kids that you have to clean your plate up. I mean, eat until you're full, and not only eat good healthy food, but eat until you're full. And, because one thing I always say is, and I get it, we have parents and grandparents that grew up in the Depression and they were worried about wasting food. Well, let's just face it, Sean. We do not have a problem with too little of food anymore. I mean,
No.
the part of our major problem in the United States is we have too much food. And that's why there's an epidemic of obesity, because we have too much food. We have unlimited food sources pretty much when we go home. Um, and so we need to teach ourselves that it's okay to throw away food, because either it's wasted in the government in the garbage can, or it's wasted around our waist. And it's a lot more expensive to be wasted around the waist.
I've never heard it put that way before. I really like the way you described that.
Right?
Putting, in the garbage or on the waste, either way, it's going somewhere.
Yeah.
And that's good too. And I think the other thing too is like breakfast. I'm not sure how it was, with your kids growing up, but I find often now just having very basic cooking skills. So when I'm doing education workshops with young kids or even adults, just simple things like, hey, how do you cook an egg? Because I think growing up I had a lot of Pop-Tarts as a kid were my
Yep.
breakfasts, or toaster
Yep.
strudels. And looking at it back, I kind of cringe, looking at my
I
dad
hear you.
eating
I hear you.
choices. Frosted Flakes was always one there, but I look back at there and think like, oh, I did that because that's all I knew how to do. I didn't know how to make things like eggs, which are take 3 minutes to fry on a
Yeah.
oven pan, or something as basic as oatmeal, or things of that nature. So that's the other thing that I try to put a lot of emphasis on when I'm working with families, is just developing basic cooking skills at a young age, and how that can really set you up. Because now, if you only have a hammer, everything's a nail, right? But now if you have different ways to make food, it becomes a lot more fun. You can still do it in 5 minutes, even if you feel like you don't have much time. So those are other ways, or smoothies occasionally, just trying to introduce different food options that sometimes, if you're used to being in a habit, having someone just mention these other ideas, like, oh, I never thought about that. That is pretty easy. It only takes 4 or 5 minutes. So that's the other thing that I've been found impactful working with families in terms of getting better food options for kids.
Well, I think speaking of cooking eggs, I think another thing is just food preparation and preparing for a few days ahead of time. I know Janet and I are, we're notorious for doing this. Whether we cook up, a couple pounds of hamburger, which we're not going to eat all at one setting, but that can feed us, for the next couple days. And instead of eating junk, you can eat, ground beef. Same thing with eggs. Why not hard boil, you know, a dozen eggs? And when you want a healthy snack, have a couple eggs and you'll be full. But think about the Pop-Tart analogy. How many Pop-Tarts can you eat?
Oh, you can go
I,
through a
I,
lot.
I mean, I could eat 5, 6 probably. I mean, seriously. But
Yeah.
seriously, two eggs, maximum 3, I'm done. And that's
Yeah.
only 70 calories an egg. So you're talking for 3 eggs, you're talking 210 calories. I imagine one Pop-Tart has 200 plus calories.
Ooh, I would have to imagine.
Yeah.
Or even, and I always think about too, when it comes to appetite and regulation, I think one of those things, those foods are so palatable when you combine sugar with salt with fat. Like, it's like Dorito Cool Ranch chips is so hard.
Right.
Like that's a struggle. But so it always goes back to is nutrient dense foods. I think often we're eating for hunger, but I think it's really our body just saying, hey, we need to get nutrients in our body.
Yeah.
And if I'm trying to get nutrients from Pop-Tarts, I'm gonna have to eat a lot of Pop-Tarts to get a given amount of nutrients. Where I think if you're having more of those nutrient dense foods, it not only does it kind of shut the hunger off quicker, but I have better focus during the day, energy. I know in a previous conversation we touched on the whole ADHD epidemic in kids, and so I always think about all these things kind of playing together from a health and wellness standpoint.
Well, speaking of nutrient density, really with Pop-Tarts, I mean, let's face it. I mean, the only thing you got there is caloric density.
Ooh,
I mean,
yeah.
seriously, what kind of nutrients are in Pop-Tarts? And that's why you can just keep eating them and keep eating them, and it will go to your waist because it's going to get stored as extra calories, as extra fuel, because there's just not a lot of nutrients in it. Whereas eggs, you talked about all the healthy stuff in eggs. I mean, go ahead and name the stuff that's in eggs besides,
Oh, you have
protein and choline and what else?
Oh, you have so many vitamins, minerals. You have a bunch of antioxidants.
Yeah.
The carotenoid antioxidants in particular, they're really rich in. Carotenoids are what gives it that bright orangish yellow color. And we know that, antioxidants are the key to helping to reduce inflammation naturally. We know that inflammation is the root cause of every chronic disease out there. So, I mean, you're able to knock off so many different things when you have an egg.
Yeah, right. And they're inexpensive too. They're 10 cents. An
Yeah.
egg is 10 cents. For as much as people say they've gotten more expensive, still it's very, very inexpensive food.
Yeah. Relatively, I think bang for your buck, especially with protein, I don't know a better source out there than eggs, to be honest
Yeah.
with you.
What I think complements eggs very well is bacon and sausage, which are pretty inexpensive protein sources also. They are higher in fat, but I don't, so you have to worry about calories, but there again, if you're eating the right foods that satisfy your taste buds and satisfy you, you don't have to worry about overconsumption as calories as much, because you can't eat. It's harder to overeat.
No, and I think that's too. And I'm not sure if you ever run into this, but one of the things I run into is some people. Sometimes I think on a very general level, people kind of get in that trap of paralysis by analysis, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, I can do eggs, but I like it with bacon. But bacon is bad. I can't touch bacon." And all of a sudden, it's, and I always tell people like, "Hey, everything in moderation works fine. Like, I don't, for the most part, you can make those work."
Right.
So I'm glad that you brought up the sausage and the bacon aspect, because I think those are fine in moderation, having those. And like you said, usually appetite's going to cut that off just because they are so dense with the nutrition.
Yeah, absolutely. Janet?
So I got to jump in a little bit for the parents out there. Nutrition really is important as our brain and bodies are developing. And that's something that, I mean, if you are eating a lot of the boxed and pre-made food like our Pop-Tarts that we're talking about, you're really not feeding the brain, and you're not feeding the body or even building blocks of the body, correct?
Correct. And that's a great point. So you think about it, as you're a young person, the brain is developing so fast. And so I think about things like omega-3s.
I was gonna say,
You set up perfect. That was like a John Stockton move right there.
Yeah.
Who's been a fan on your show. And so I think that's a great point, is the importance of getting these nutrients in, because not only is that going to make you feel a lot better now, that's going to set you up for success later in life.
Well, and when you think about, how concentrated our brain tissue is in omega-3s and cholesterol, for instance, you got to ask yourself how much, that Pop-Tart, I mean, how much nutrients does that Pop-Tart have to feed your brain besides besides sugar? Really, that's about it.
Yeah, it's not offering a whole lot there. And the other thing I think, as we're setting up for success, I always think about schools as well. So one of the groups I'm really active in, a lot of the communities I work, is education within schools. And I think, and this goes back to both, nutrition education, but even just daily movement, because I know we're kind of focused on both nutrition and fitness for kids. And I think that's another area as parents to, whatever school district that you're part of, as much as possible, try to push for, the health and wellness departments to advocate, not only for your kid, but for the entire, student body. I think that's another area that's really important.
Well, and I know that there's, I know when our kids were in a private school, I mean, the private school was always looking for people to volunteer to speak about, nutrition, or to show people how to do certain movements with resistance training, kettlebells, whatever, because they don't always have those people available. So if a parent is willing to step up and do that, I mean, it goes a long ways for a lot of people.
And it's big too, and I always tell everyone to be able to help to educate, to help be able to support, health and wellness programs in school. You don't need to be like a PhD. I think most people know at the basic, hey, fruit and vegetables are really important. Protein sources are important. One easy analogy I'll use, this is with both kids and adults, but I'll always use hand references. So like, hey, your fist is roughly the serving of fruits and vegetables.
Yep.
And it's fun because I can say, hey, eat, say 6 servings of vegetables, fruits and vegetables a day, whatever it is. Well, that same thing applies to both a kid and an adult, because a kid's obviously a kid doesn't, an 8-year-old doesn't necessarily need as much as a grown adult, but they also have a smaller fist,
Yeah.
right? So it all scales relative to their body. So that's a fun thing that I've been able to found work with schools. Another thing that's super fun with schools or young kids or groups is, I was just working with a child care center a couple weeks ago, and we had 5 different things on a plate. It was pumpkin seeds, chocolate chips, cranberries, frozen blueberries, and carrots, like the crinkled cut carrots. And basically, I would have kids each try once, and then they had to use adjectives to describe those foods. So all of a sudden it became cool. You're trying to incorporate, okay, the number of kids who had crinkle cut carrots, they've never had them before. Like, oh, they're rough, but they're chewy, but there's some sweetness to it. So again, trying to incorporate different things like that have been really fun within school districts.
So let's go back on to movement. And I love how you describe it as movement, because sometimes we use the word exercise and it scares people. When really in reality, 100 years ago, I mean, there was no such thing as scheduling exercise. I mean, seriously, think about it.
Yeah.
It's because people worked physical labor jobs, so they were moving all the time already. There was I don't even know if I'm sure there were some kind of boutique gyms or something 100 years ago, but they were very, very rare. People didn't have to go to the gym because they were moving all day. So give us some tips how, as adults, we can teach our kids how to move.
The two things that I would recommend here working with a lot of kids is, one, if you're going to be involved in sports, make it a variety of sports. One of the things I see happening too often now, and I think they actually it sets up for failure, is you'll see like a 10-year-old, a parent will come in like, hey, will you, help train my 10-year-old? Great, that's fine. Like, what sports do they all play? And they're like, oh, he or she only plays baseball or softball the entire year.
Right.
So and I think that's one of the things, you get overuse injuries. I think kids get burnt out. And I think it almost sets the stage is if you get burnt out with, say, a sports when you're, 15 years old, all of a sudden they have a negative relationship with movement, which causes issues down the road. So that's what I always tell people is make sure you're involved. If you're gonna do sports, do a variety of sports. And I'm also a big fan of, just for lack of better words, free play. And what I mean by that, I think right now, so many kids are so structured in what they're doing, where even if they're playing multiple sports, it's not like, hey, I remember growing up, like I played sports, but I also did a lot of just playing recess, like tag, hide and go seek, like building for, like, all those different things where it's like there wasn't structured. I had to think about movement while trying to process things, but it wasn't like structured 24/7. I think that's, something too that's really impactful to develop those healthy relationships with movement that carry on throughout life.
Yeah, Janet has some pretty strong opinions about
I do.
kids focusing on one
I
sport.
tell you, I think it's parent driven. And even if the child likes it, that's great. But the overuse thing and the mental stress that you put on your child when you tell them they're going to be an Olympic champion, or you're going to be the pitcher at Stanford, or you're going to be on the Mariners team, whatever you're telling your child, let them dream and decide. It's our duty, I think, as parents to introduce them to things and show them things in life, and then let them decide what they love and what they're passionate about. That pressure is just not healthy at all. And when we're talking about that free thing, I identified with this as like, Shawn and I ride our bikes a lot, but when you were a kid, man, you just jumped on your bike and rode. You just went somewhere, right? And it was just, your brain went with it, your body went with it. It was all fun. It wasn't like this and I'm not saying we shouldn't do that as adults, but there is some place that children need to go to have that brain space and to just enjoy life. And I think that's what I'm identifying with what you're saying, is that free play is, hey, just be a kid. Just enjoy the moment.
Well, and I think talking about playing multiple sports, I think that goes to the same, that is on the same subject, because let's face it, I don't want to burst anybody's bubbles, but I also am just a truthful person, and most people's kids are not going to be professional athletes. And Shawn, you've coached professional athletes, so you know that. I mean, the chances of ever being a professional athlete, actually even succeeding in college, is very, very, very slim. And we taught our kids that early on. So one thing we told them to do is like, look, we want to expose you to lots of sports because we want you to be active in something the rest of your life. One of the things that we see very often in kids at our kids' age is, they were very competitive in football in high school. After high school went away, they don't do anything. And that's part of the problem. And if you think about why we had multiple sports in and why we had seasons, okay, baseball is a warm weather sport. We play baseball in the summer. Football's a cold weather sport. You've got all these pads on you. it's a cold weather sport. We play it in the fall and the winter. Basketball, we play in the winter, in the middle of the winter, because it's a indoor sport. And when you think about this, and I would love your opinion on this. And I don't remember if it's Nick Saban or if it was I can't remember if it's Nick Saban or who was the coach for Ohio for a while, Urban Myers.
Urban Myers.
Yeah. One of those coaches says that they tried to pick athletes that played 3 sports in high school to come to, because they were just better overall athletes. And because chances are you're not going to play a professional sport. Don't you want to just be an overall general better athlete and better health? What's your opinion?
100%. I always see the best athletes are always the ones that are doing multiple sports. And the thing you always see is you can have a skill in one sport that translates over to another sport. I think basketball and baseball, very different movement sports, but hand-eye coordination is pretty dang important in each one of those.
Yeah. Yeah.
And one of my mentors on the coaching side, I remember him telling me, and he's like, when it comes to athletics, Shawn, the goal is not to create an adapted athlete. The goal is to create an adaptable athlete. In other words, you want to have an athlete. I think it was Steve Meerland who said that, but he said, you want to have an athlete where you put them in a new situation, they feel very comfortable because they have the general skill background set where they can adapt their body to the movements needed to succeed in that environment.
Yeah. And, some examples of that is, look at Steph Curry. I mean, one of the best basketball players of all time. He's also a par golfer. I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised. He knows what it takes to win and to achieve. And he knows what his body needs to do it. And, you look at a lot of other athletes, especially football and baseball crossovers, Bo Jackson, Russell Wilson, Deion Sanders, all those guys could play both those sports incredibly well because they were, what'd you call it? Adaptable athlete? How'd you say that?
Yeah. They're an adaptable athlete. In other words, they were not adapted to a sport. They were adaptable just as themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. And speaking of the injuries too, I mean, I can tell you, being a competitive mountain bike racer myself, I mean, and I have a coach that coaches me, and one of the things that a coach will do is tell you when it's time to take time off. And if you're doing something repetitively, whether you're a pitcher or whether you're a biker, you're going to get hip flexor issues or whatever if you don't take some time off.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing that with the injuries, but and this was something your Janet touched on, was just the mental, the pressure, the stresses. Here's something that most people fail to take into account. Let's say if you have a 10-year-old. So most sports are like, hey, if your birthday's before this date, you're on the 10-year-old team. If your birthday's after this date, you're on the 11-year-old team or whatever. So there's roughly like the year cutoffs, right? Well, if you have a 10-year-old who was born, say, one day or 363 days before then, and then on a team, and then you also have somebody on the team who was born one day before that cutoff. When you're 10 years old, that's like
that's huge.
That's like someone in their 50 being 5 to 10 years older. I mean, that's like 15% of someone's lifetime, or 10%. That's, and I think that's what gets missed when you're only trying to do one sport. Is like, oh man, like I'm not successful here. I'm no good. Like I hate sports. I hate this stuff. As opposed to, if you're constantly doing different sports, you're going to find one that you succeed in. And if you're not so specialized, you're going to have a greater I think you're going to have greater confidence just because you're not playing against someone who's 10% older than you, which is a huge, at that point in life.
Well, and you do, and there is so much crossover from one sport to the next sport. When it comes to, the muscles you use, although it's a little bit different, but it's still the same. I mean, that's why it's important to do multiple sports. I think of, even, and you'll know this because even here's a good example. Back, when I was a kid in elementary school, Eric Heiden was a ice skater, Olympic ice skater. Do you remember him?
Yeah.
Well, there was back, 45, 50 years ago, you couldn't ice skate in the summer. You just couldn't. That wasn't available. Now those guys can ice skate year round. But what would Eric Heiden do in the off season this summer? He would bike. and talk about a sport to grow your quads, which, cycling and ice skating, very quad intensive. I mean, so, and but yet he still worked enough to have a different muscle that you wouldn't have overuse injuries. So that's part of the problem now, is we have the ability to practice. We have the ability to play baseball year round. We used to not, because you couldn't play baseball in February in Massachusetts. But now you can, because there's so many indoor stadiums and there's pitching machines and all that. And that's kind of the same problem that we've had with our food supply.
Yeah.
Is that we have an unlimited food supply now. We have refrigeration, we have pantries, we have ways of storing food, and where we used to not. So that's why we used to not have as much problems with obesity, because we just didn't have as much food.
It's crazy, the parallels between the two. Is now the biggest issue is not scarcity, the biggest issue is abundance.
Yeah,
Both
exactly.
from a movement standpoint with respect to sport, as well as from a food standpoint.
Yeah. So as we wrap this podcast up, I'm going to put you on the spot.
All right.
I want you to give one nutrition tip and one fitness or movement tip, however we want to define that, to parents to get their kids started on a healthy life journey.
Okay. Number one on the food tip would be take your kids grocery shopping and cook a meal with them. And
Awesome.
on movement standpoint is let your kids create movement with them.
Awesome.
That sounded really, the last one may have sounded too vague, but what I mean is go outside, play, run around, and just have that variety.
I love it. All right. So as we wrap this podcast up, Shawn, what is the best way to get a hold of you if anybody has any questions?
If anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to me on Facebook, on Shawn Casey. I'm really active on Facebook. I try to respond to everyone's message. You can also go to my website. It's caseperformance.com. And then I'm also active on Instagram as well. But I enjoy people reaching out to me. I always try to respond to every message that comes through on there. It makes it fun, and I learn so much working with people.
Awesome. I love it, Shawn. So thank you so much. We've learned a lot from you. So thank you for being on today.
Hey, well, thank you. Have a great day.
All right. Listeners and viewers, thank you for being on Health Solutions with Shawn and Janet Needham. Tune into our regularly scheduled podcast, or our midweek scheduled podcast, which is Thursday, 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. We'll see you then. Health Solutions with Shawn and Janet Needham. Thank you.